Long before anyone associated Engelbert Humperdinck with romance, immaculate suits, or a voice built for candlelit rooms, he was surviving in small British clubs by pretending to be other men. That was the first life almost nobody remembers, twisting his face, changing his voice, and borrowing the nervous energy of the American comedian. Then he might shift into Dean Martin, lowering his expression into something cooler and more controlled. Sammy Davis Jr. could appear next. A different posture, a different rhythm, another personality placed temporarily over his own. The audience laughed. The club owners were satisfied, and the young performer earned enough attention to be invited back. But underneath every imitation was a strange contradiction. The man who would eventually possess one of the most recognizable voices in popular music was still afraid to reveal it. His beginnings offered no obvious sign that he would become a romantic superstar. He entered the world in Madras during the final years of British rule in India, surrounded not by entertainment executives or wealthy patrons, but by a crowded household. He was one of 10 children. Privacy was scarce. Noise was normal. In a family that large, a child learned quickly when to speak, when to listen, and how to find a place without demanding the entire room. Those lessons stayed with him. Even after audiences began treating him like royalty, part of him remained the observant boy, accustomed to standing among many brothers and sisters. Music entered his life through an unexpected doorway. He did not initially dream of becoming a singer. Singing required exposure. It meant standing still while people examined not only the sound, but the person producing it. For someone naturally shy, an instrument felt safer. The saxophone gave him protection. He could lift it to his mouth, place something physical between himself and the audience, and let the metal carry the emotion. According to later accounts, the lessons were not simply handed to him. He helped pay for them with money earned from a paper route, bringing home only a few shillings each week. That detail reveals more than any glamorous publicity photograph ever could. Before luxury hotels and custom tailoring, there were early mornings, newspapers, cold streets, and a boy calculating whether his small earnings could keep his musical education alive. The future was not guaranteed. Music was something he had to purchase a few coins at a time. During his teenage years, he played saxophone in local nightclubs. He could blend into a band and contribute without becoming its emotional center. That suited him. He wanted music, but he did not yet want the vulnerability that came with singing. Then someone heard him. The reaction surprised everyone, including the young man himself. The sound that emerged did not match his hesitation. It was rich, unusually mature, and much larger than the personality presenting it. Friends recognized a power he had not fully accepted. Still, having a voice was not the same as knowing what to do with it. He needed work. He needed material. Above all, he needed to keep strangers entertained before they had any reason to care about his original songs. So he developed another skill, disappearance. Instead of asking the crowd to accept him, he offered familiar personalities. Jerry Lewis was especially important. The comedian's broadcasts had reached him through the radio, carrying the excitement of American entertainment into an ordinary British home. By studying Lewis, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., and other performers, he learned more than imitation. He learned timing. He learned how silence could prepare a laugh. He learned that an audience could be guided without realizing it. He learned how the smallest facial movement could change the atmosphere of an entire room. Years later, he finally met Jerry Lewis. The encounter could easily have become uncomfortable. There stood the original man, facing someone who had once earned money reproducing his mannerisms. Instead, Lewis gave him a compliment he never forgot, reportedly telling him that his impression was the finest version of Jerry Lewis he had heard. By then, the imitation belonged to history, but its importance remained. Those early performances created a hidden education. Behind the comic voices, Engelbert was studying human behavior. He was learning how audiences breathed, where their attention weakened, and what made them lean forward again. The emotional control later associated with his singing did not appear by accident. It was developed in rooms where failure could be measured immediately by silence. His musical ambitions were interrupted when he entered the British Army's Royal Corps of Signals. The uniform imposed another identity, disciplined, punctual, obedient, and far removed from the uncertain freedom of nightclubs. Once again, he lived between versions of himself. There was the serviceman following orders, the saxophonist hiding behind brass, the impressionist borrowing famous voices, and somewhere beneath all three was a singer whose real sound had not yet found its proper name, audience, or destination. The public would eventually believe he arrived fully formed, confident, polished, and naturally comfortable under observation. Seles was himself. The enormous sign outside the Riviera Hotel should have carried only one name, his own. Instead, another name appeared above it. Dean Martin presents Engelbert Humperdinck. For a performer still establishing himself in America, those words were more valuable than an expensive advertising campaign. Dean Martin was not simply famous. He represented a particular kind of effortless confidence that could not be manufactured by a publicity department. He walked into a room as though he had nothing to prove, and people immediately wanted to watch him. Engelbert understood the significance of the gesture. Martin was part owner of the Riviera, and placing his own name beside Engelbert's was a public endorsement. To tourists passing beneath the bright Las Vegas signs, it suggested that this unfamiliar British singer belonged in the same world as the established American giants. Behind the scenes, something more personal was developing. The two men began dining together. Their friendship grew away from cameras, without the rehearsed warmth often created for entertainment magazines. Engelbert listened carefully when Martin spoke, but he also studied what Martin did not say. That was where the real education happened. Martin seemed relaxed to the point of carelessness. He was famous for avoiding long rehearsals and sometimes relied on cue cards, yet when the performance began, he appeared completely in control. His apparent casualness was not laziness, it was a carefully understood character. Engelbert noticed the difference. A singer could deliver every note correctly and still leave the audience untouched. An entertainer had to make the audience believe something was happening in the moment. The lyrics could not merely be pronounced, they needed to pass through the body. Martin gave him a principle that quietly changed his approach. Do not simply sing the song, act it. From then on, Engelbert began treating every number as a miniature drama. Where was the man in the lyric standing emotionally? Was he pleading, remembering, resisting, or surrendering? What had happened before the first line? What would remain unresolved after the final one? These questions created the private life hidden inside his performances. The public saw a vocalist. Engelbert was privately constructing characters. A slight turn of the head could suggest hesitation. A hand raised too quickly might make the emotion appear false. Remaining motionless during the right sentence could become more powerful than crossing the entire stage. Even his breathing needed to belong to the person inside the song. This was not visible preparation. There were no elaborate sets explaining the story. The transformation occurred through small decisions that audiences felt without consciously recognizing. That control became one of his most useful secrets. He understood that restraint could create intimacy in a large room. Instead of competing with the size of a theater, he could make thousands of people feel they were overhearing something private. The performance became less about demonstrating vocal power and more about creating the illusion of confession. Offstage, he could be humorous, observant, and surprisingly playful. Once the music started, another personality took control. Composed, deliberate, and emotionally certain. The contrast was carefully maintained. People assumed the confidence was natural because they never saw the calculation beneath it. They did not see him absorbing lessons from veteran entertainers or thinking about how one movement might alter the meaning of a sentence. They saw the finished illusion. Dean Martin's generosity had given him more than a prestigious name on a hotel sign. It provided access to a different understanding of show business. Fame was not sustained by a voice alone. It required presence, character, discipline, and the ability to conceal the work. Engelbert was learning to perform emotion without allowing the audience to see the machinery behind it. And that may have been the most convincing double life of all. While the world believed it was watching a man reveal himself through music, Engelbert was often doing something far more complicated. He was disappearing into a role. For a while, the photographs suggested friendship. Engelbert Humperdinck and Tom Jones stood close enough to look like two men sharing the same extraordinary adventure. Both had powerful voices. Both came from modest backgrounds. Both were transformed into international stars under the direction of the same manager, Gordon Mills. They appeared to belong to one musical family. Behind that image, however, the atmosphere was becoming increasingly difficult. Tom had arrived first. His voice was rougher, more explosive, and connected naturally with the changing energy of the 1960s. Engelbert occupied another space. His delivery was smoother. His manner was controlled. Where Tom seemed ready to tear through a song, Engelbert appeared determined to hold every emotion inside its proper frame. The comparisons began almost immediately. Journalists treated them like opposing sides of the same contest. Fans argued over which voice was stronger. Promoters understood that rivalry attracted attention, even when neither singer wanted to spend every interview discussing the other. Engelbert had entered a business where individual identity mattered. Yet his career was constantly measured against someone standing only a few feet away. The situation was made more complicated by Gordon Mills. Mills was not merely arranging bookings. He was shaping careers, selecting material, negotiating contracts, and deciding how each performer would be presented. From Engelbert's perspective, Tom sometimes received the greater share of his manager's attention. That feeling could not easily be expressed in public. A successful entertainer was expected to appear grateful. Complaining risked making him look insecure. Admitting competition could suggest that the elegant confidence surrounding him was less solid than audiences believed. So another division appeared. In public, Engelbert behaved like a professional sharing the industry with another major singer. Privately, he was trying to determine whether there was room for both men without one permanently being treated as the other's shadow. Their voices were different, but the business kept placing them in the same category. Their clothing was compared. Their audiences were compared. Their television appearances were compared. Even their appeal to women became part of the competition. For Engelbert, this created a problem that could not be solved by singing louder. Trying to imitate Tom's force would erase the qualities that distinguished him. He needed to become more recognizable without appearing desperate for recognition. He responded by sharpening every visible detail. His hair became part of the silhouette. His sideburns, formal clothing, posture, and carefully measured gestures helped create a figure audiences could identify before he sang a note. Nothing needed to look accidental, even when the effect was supposed to feel effortless. The transformation went beyond fashion. Engelbert learned to occupy space differently. He did not rush to fill every second. He allowed anticipation to gather around him. The slower movements, extended eye contact, and controlled stillness created a presence separate from Tom's physical intensity. Competition forced him to define himself, yet it also created wounds that survived much longer than the musical era that produced them. At some point, the early friendliness between the two men disappeared. The precise cause has remained disputed. Different stories have circulated, but no single explanation has completely settled the matter. What is certain is that the distance became real. They stopped behaving like colleagues who had simply taken separate paths. The silence hardened. Years became decades. For the public, the two singers continued to exist beside each other in old photographs, television clips, compilation albums, and memories of British entertainment. In real life, they remained divided by something neither man seemed able or willing to resolve. That is where Engelbert's public personality concealed another private struggle. He was known for warmth. He smiled easily during interviews. He spoke to audiences as though they were old friends. His shows were built around closeness and emotional invitation. Yet one of the few people who truly understood the strange pressure of his rise wanted nothing to do with him. Engelbert has since attempted to lower the temperature. He has praised Tom's ability, calling him one of the world's great singers. He has said that he does not enjoy carrying grudges and that life is too short for permanent hostility. Tom's response has remained far less forgiving. That imbalance reveals something uncomfortable. A person can offer reconciliation, but he cannot create it alone. Apology, explanation, or time may change one side without changing the other. For Engelbert, The unresolved rivalry became another part of his double existence. He could walk into a theatre and receive affection from thousands. He could speak graciously about a man who once stood beside him. He could insist that competition did not erase admiration, but he could not rewrite the private history between them. The photographs remained friendly, the reality did not. And behind the polished image of an entertainer who always appeared in control was a relationship he could never bring to a proper ending. The rejection should have been final. A recording connected to Jerry Dorsey had been taken to Decca Records, and the response was disappointing. The singer had talent, experience, and years of determination behind him. None of that seemed enough to make the industry pay attention. Then Gordon Mills changed one detail. He replaced the name on the recording. The music remained the same. The voice remained the same. The man behind it had not suddenly become more gifted. Yet when the record returned under the name Engelbert Humperdinck, another executive responded differently. The new identity opened a door the old one could not. That moment revealed something both brilliant and unsettling about show business. An audience rarely meets a performer without preparation. Before the first note is heard, the name, photograph, clothing, and story have already created expectations. Jerry Dorsey sounded familiar and ordinary. Engelbert Humperdinck was impossible to ignore. It belonged originally to the German composer associated with the opera Hansel and Gretel. For a British popular singer, the name seemed absurdly long. Radio presenters struggled with it. Some people laughed when they first heard it, but they remembered it. Engelbert initially resisted. He had already spent years trying to establish Jerry Dorsey. Abandoning that name meant admitting that the first version of his career had failed. It also meant walking into rooms and introducing himself with an identity that did not yet feel connected to his body. Gradually, the resistance disappeared. The new name began appearing on posters, contracts, hotel signs, record sleeves, and television schedules. Fans repeated it. Reporters printed it. Strangers called it across crowded rooms. Soon, even members of his family adopted it. Arnold George Dorsey had become Jerry during his early performing years. Jerry was then replaced by Engelbert. Each transformation moved him further from the name he had been given at birth. The stage identity no longer ended when the performance did. That created a peculiar form of success. The invention became more famous than the person who carried it. Engelbert was not merely a professional label. It shaped how he dressed, spoke, entered rooms, and responded to public attention. Eventually, the name became so dominant that returning to Arnold would have seemed like pretending. Yet there was a cost hidden inside the triumph. When an invented identity rescues a career, it becomes difficult to question it. Engelbert could not simply discard the name after it had given him recognition. He had to continue feeding the character that audiences had accepted. The public expected elegance. They expected charm. They expected a man whose very name sounded larger than ordinary life. Whatever he felt privately, Engelbert had to remain recognizable. The identity could evolve, but it could never collapse completely without threatening the business built around it. For years, people believed the unusual name was merely a clever publicity decision. In reality, it became something much deeper. It divided one life into several men: Arnold, the private beginning; Jerry, the struggling performer; and Engelbert, the creation who finally conquered the world. The final irony was impossible to miss. He had searched for recognition for years. When recognition finally arrived, it came only after the industry stopped using his real name. In 2012, Engelbert Humperdinck agreed to enter a world that no longer seemed designed for men like him. The Eurovision Song Contest had changed dramatically since his earliest years in entertainment. It was no longer simply a parade of singers standing beside orchestras in formal clothing. The modern competition had become a television spectacle, filled with elaborate lighting, electronic production, dancers, visual effects, and songs constructed to capture attention within seconds. Engelbert was 76. Many of the contestants surrounding him were young enough to be his grandchildren. To the British public, his selection was both impressive and puzzling. Some viewed it as a mark of respect. Others treated it as evidence that the country had run out of contemporary ideas. His name attracted international attention, but it also made him an easy target. The same experience could be described in two completely different ways. One version presented him as a national treasure, carrying decades of experience onto Europe's largest musical stage. The other presented him as an aging performer, being sent into a competition dominated by youth, speed, novelty, and spectacle. Engelbert accepted the invitation without publicly behaving as though it were beneath him. He approached the contest seriously and recorded "Love Will Set You Free," a restrained ballad written to emphasize interpretation rather than vocal acrobatics. There was no attempt to disguise him as a younger artist. He did not arrive with electronic beats, outrageous costumes, or a complicated dance routine. The performance was built around a familiar belief that one singer, one melody, and one emotional story could still hold the attention of a massive audience. That confidence was genuine, but it also concealed the risk. Throughout his career, Engelbert had usually entered rooms where people had already paid to see him. His concerts were filled with listeners who understood his style before the first song began. Eurovision offered no such protection. Millions of viewers would compare him instantly with performers from across the continent, many representing musical cultures that had evolved far beyond traditional ballad singing. He was no longer the unquestioned attraction. He was one competitor among 26. Even the performance order worked against the sense of ceremony surrounding him. Engelbert was chosen to sing first in the grand final in Baku, Azerbaijan. Before the audience had settled into the long evening, before voting impressions had fully formed, the British entry was already over. Then came the waiting. That may have been the strangest role of the night. Engelbert had spent decades learning to control an audience through timing. At Eurovision, control belonged elsewhere. Cameras moved according to a broadcast plan. Countries announced points one after another. National alliances, contemporary tastes, staging, popularity, and countless unpredictable factors shaped the result. Experience could prepare him to sing. It could not prepare Europe to vote for him. As the scoreboard developed, the British entry remained near the bottom. Love Will Set You Free eventually received 12 points and finished 25th, ahead of only one country. For an inexperienced performer, the result might have been dismissed as one difficult night. For a man carrying a legendary reputation, it produced a more complicated image. Newspapers could not resist the contrast. One of Britain's most famous international singers had entered Eurovision and nearly finished last. The number was simple, dramatic, and easy to repeat. What the scoreboard did not measure was the courage required to participate. Engelbert had little to gain from the contest. Winning would have introduced him to a younger generation, but defeat could be used to question whether his era had passed. He had voluntarily placed a carefully protected legacy before an audience that owed him nothing. That decision revealed the division at the center of his later career. Publicly, he remained the established legend, a performer whose name carried historical weight. Privately, he still possessed the hunger of the unknown singer who once needed every opportunity he could find. A man entirely satisfied with his reputation might have declined Eurovision. He could have argued that competitions belonged to beginners. He could have protected himself behind past achievements and avoided the possibility of public embarrassment. Engelbert chose exposure instead. Afterward, he did not disappear. He continued recording, touring, appearing in interviews, and discussing the experience with the perspective of someone who had survived much greater changes than one disappointing result. Yet his later comments suggested that he understood the contest had not been built around his strengths. Eurovision rewarded immediate visual impact and musical trends that could cross borders quickly. Engelbert represented another tradition, one in which a singer was allowed time to establish mood and slowly lead the listener into the lyric. In Baku, those two worlds met. The old professional stood inside a modern machine. The audience saw a calm man in formal clothing, apparently untouched by the pressure. What they could not see was the deeper contest taking place beneath the official one. Engelbert was not only competing against 25 songs, he was competing against the assumption that age should make a person cautious. He was competing against the belief that a legend should remain safely inside his own period. Most of all, he was confronting the possibility that the identity which had once made him extraordinary could now make him seem out of place. The scoreboard placed him 25th, but the result also exposed something more revealing than victory might have done. Behind the established name was still a performer willing to risk looking foolish rather than become invisible. For one night, the legend and the outsider occupied the same body, and although Europe did not reward him, Engelbert had proved that the second man had never disappeared. By the time Engelbert Humperdinck reached the later decades of his career, the public version of him had become almost permanent. People expected the immaculate appearance. They expected the deep voice, the careful manners, the familiar smile, and the sense that he had stepped out of another era without allowing that era to disappear. For many performers, growing older creates permission to relax the image. They become less formal. They speak more casually. They allow the distance between the public figure and the private person to shrink. Engelbert moved in the opposite direction. The older he became, the more carefully he seemed to preserve the figure audiences remembered. That was not simple vanity. It was responsibility. His audience did not attend only to hear music. They came to recover a particular feeling. Some wanted to remember the clothes they had worn, the cars they had driven, or the living rooms where his records had once played. Others arrived carrying memories connected to people who could no longer attend with them. Engelbert understood that he represented more than himself. He represented continuity. That realization created the final version of his double life. Away from public attention, he was an aging man subject to the same physical limits, doubts, fatigue, and passing time as everyone else. Once he appeared before an audience, he became the guardian of a memory that thousands of people did not want to lose. The transformation required discipline. Travel did not become easier with age. Rehearsals still demanded concentration. A voice that had once responded instinctively required greater care. Every performance involved choices about energy, timing, and recovery that younger audiences rarely considered. The public saw elegance. They did not see preparation. They did not see the hours spent protecting the instrument, changing arrangements, or learning how to use experience where youthful strength had once been enough. Engelbert refused to make age the entire story. He could acknowledge it with humor, but he did not allow it to become an apology. He continued recording newer material, rather than presenting himself only as a museum of former success. He worked with musicians from different generations, entered unfamiliar musical settings, and treated his catalogue as something that could still evolve. That decision was important. Nostalgia can become a prison for an established artist. Audiences demand the songs they already know, while every new song risks being treated as an interruption. The performer is expected to repeat the past exactly, while somehow preventing it from feeling old. Engelbert learned to live inside that contradiction. He respected the material that built his reputation, but he resisted becoming completely frozen inside it. He could perform a familiar standard and then introduce a song recorded decades later, quietly insisting that the man standing there was not only a memory. This required another kind of acting. He had to appear timeless without pretending time had stopped. He had to honor the younger figure preserved in photographs without competing directly against him. Most of all, he had to face an opponent no manager, costume, or stage technique could defeat: the archive. Old performances remained available everywhere. A listener could watch him at the height of his physical power and seconds later compare that image with the man he had become. Few earlier generations of entertainers had faced such constant comparison with their own youth. Engelbert did not hide from it. Instead, he allowed the contrast to become part of the performance. The younger man provided the memory. The older man provided interpretation. The same lyric could carry two different meanings depending on which version of him delivered it. What had once sounded like confidence might later sound like reflection. A phrase previously carried by vocal force could now depend on patience, timing, and the weight of experience. That was the hidden advantage of survival. He could no longer be the performer he had been in the late 1960s, but no younger singer could reproduce the decades inside his voice. The public often describes longevity as though it were passive, as if a career simply continues because the person refuses to stop. In reality, remaining visible requires constant adjustment. Styles change. Record companies change. Television changes. Audiences disappear, and new ones arrive with different expectations. Engelbert survived because he understood adaptation without complete surrender. He never abandoned the identity that made him recognizable. At the same time, he repeatedly placed that identity in new surroundings. Duets, contemporary recordings, television appearances, international tours, and unexpected collaborations allowed the familiar character to keep moving. The strategy looked effortless from outside. It was anything but effortless. The name, voice, clothing, and manner had once been tools used to escape obscurity. Eventually, they became obligations he carried into every room. There were surely moments when he wanted to be less recognizable. A famous face cannot simply observe. It is observed. A familiar voice cannot speak in public without someone waiting to hear the singer inside it. The persona that rescued Arnold Dorsey from failure eventually demanded loyalty from him. He had created Engelbert Humperdinck. Then Engelbert Humperdinck began deciding how Arnold would live. That may be the secret hidden beneath the title of his story. His double life was never only a matter of public and private behavior. It was the long negotiation between the ordinary man and the extraordinary identity placed over him. One needed privacy, the other needed attention. One grew tired, the other was expected to remain elegant. One experienced time, the other was asked to defeat it. For decades, Engelbert carried both without completely choosing between them. Even now, when he walks into public view, the transformation happens almost automatically. The posture changes, the smile arrives, the name takes its place, the audience recognizes the legend. Somewhere behind it remains the boy with the saxophone, the impressionist borrowing other voices, the serviceman following orders, and the struggling singer whose own name could not open the right door. They never disappeared. They simply learned to live behind Engelbert Humperdinck, and perhaps that is why his story has lasted so long. The world believed it was watching one man. It was watching all of them.